Victoria Ashford opened her eyes to white ceiling tiles and the mechanical hiss of a ventilator breathing for her. The tube in her throat felt like a violation, foreign and suffocating. Her body refused to respond when she tried to move her fingers. Panic flared hot in her chest before rational thought reasserted itself. She wasn't paralyzed. She was weak. There was a difference. The distinction mattered. She'd been in the driver's seat of her Tesla Model S, leaving the Ashford Technologies campus after a brutal board meeting. The memory played back in fragments. Headlights swinging wide through an intersection. The sickening crunch of metal on metal, her head snapping sideways. Glass everywhere. Then nothing. Now she lay in what had to be a private hospital room, judging by the silence. No beeping from neighboring beds, no hushed conversations drifting through thin curtains. She could hear voices outside her door, muffled but distinct enough to parse words if she concentrated. A man's voice, clinical and detached. The doctor, probably. He was talking to someone about her condition using terms like traumatic brain injury and Glasgow Coma scale score of 3. The words landed like stones in still water. He thought she was gone. He thought her mind had fled, leaving nothing but autonomic functions behind. Victoria focused on the rhythm of the ventilator, the way it forced air into her lungs at mechanically perfect intervals. If she could hear them, could understand them, then she wasn't in a coma. She was trapped inside a body that had temporarily stopped taking orders. Locked-in syndrome. She'd read about it years ago during a security assessment for a medical technology client. The irony wasn't lost on her. She tested her theory, concentrated on slowing her breathing, fighting the ventilator's rhythm. The machine adjusted, the beeping pattern on the monitors shifted. She could control this. If she could control her breathing, she could control other autonomic responses. Heart rate, blood pressure, the readings that would tell doctors whether someone was conscious or truly gone. The voices outside grew clearer. She recognized the second speaker now. Richard Crane. Board member for 5 years, always impeccably dressed, always offering suggestions that sounded reasonable until you analyzed them and realized they were designed to slow her down. She'd tolerated him because he held 12% of the company, and removing him would cause more problems than it solved. His voice carried through the door with uncharacteristic emotion. He was talking to someone about moving forward, about how tragic this was, about how Douglas would have wanted this. The name hit Victoria like a second collision. Douglas. Not a common name in their circles, and Richard's middle name, the one buried in SEC filings, was Douglas. Douglas Crane. CEO of Crane Tech, the cybersecurity firm she'd acquired 10 years ago for $40 million after their hostile takeover attempt failed. The man who'd disappeared from the industry afterward. The man who'd reportedly taken his own life 6 months after losing his company. Richard Douglas Crane. The pieces aligned with cold precision. Richard was Douglas Crane's son. He'd spent 5 years on her board playing the long game, waiting for an opportunity like this, waiting for her to be vulnerable. Victoria's heart rate spiked. The monitors betrayed her with a rapid beeping. Footsteps rushed toward her room. She forced herself to calm, to slow her breathing, to think past the surge of adrenaline. The beeping steadied. The footsteps paused, then retreated. Someone muttered about equipment glitches. She had a decision to make, and she had perhaps 30 seconds to make it. She could fight her way back to consciousness right now. Show them she was awake, alert, capable of defending herself. Or she could stay silent. Let them think she was gone. Let them reveal themselves completely while they thought no one was watching. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. She'd spent 14 years building Ashford Technologies on the principle that information was power. Right now, she had the opportunity to gather information that no CEO ever got. She could see who remained loyal when there was no benefit to loyalty, who showed their true face when they thought the cameras were off. Victoria relaxed her body, let the ventilator do its work, kept her vitals steady and flat. She would be a ghost in her own life. She would haunt her company and see what crawled out when they thought she was gone. The doctors came in throughout the evening. They discussed her case in technical terms, reviewing CT scans and EEG readings. Dr. Chen, the attending neurologist, sounded almost apologetic as he explained to what must have been a resident that the prognosis was poor. Severe diffuse axonal injury, minimal brain activity. The kindest thing might be to let nature take its course. Victoria catalogued every word. She would remember Dr. Chen's name when this was over. Night fell. The nurses came less frequently. Victoria used the darkness to test her limits. She could move her fingers now barely a few millimeters at most. Her toes responded when she concentrated. The weakness was fading faster than she'd hoped. By tomorrow, maybe the next day, she'd regain enough control to sit up if she wanted to. But she wouldn't. Not yet. The next morning brought the first visitors. She heard them before they entered, their voices carrying through the hallway with the particular timbre of people who thought they were whispering, but weren't. The board members. She recognized each voice as they filed in. Richard, of course. Margaret Hall, the CFO who'd been pushing for more conservative strategies. David Wells, the youngest board member brought on 2 years ago because his venture capital firm had invested heavily in the company. They gathered around her bed. Margaret touched the railing, her hand cold and tentative. She made sympathetic noises about the tragedy, about how sudden it all was. Richard agreed with solemn gravity. He said something about ensuring the company's stability during this difficult time. Margaret mentioned interim leadership arrangements. David said nothing, but Victoria could hear him shifting his weight, uncomfortable. They moved to the corner of the room away from the bed. Their voices dropped, but not enough. Richard was outlining a plan. A temporary removal of Victoria as CEO just until the situation clarified. Margaret thought that made sense from a fiduciary standpoint. The shareholders would want to see decisive action. David offered a weak protest about it being premature, only 9 days since the accident. Richard shut him down with practiced ease, citing medical opinions and market volatility. They left together, already planning their next move. Victoria lay perfectly still, absorbing every word, every betrayal. She'd known Richard was ambitious. She'd suspected Margaret was more concerned with stability than vision. But hearing them discuss her removal while she was still breathing, still technically their CEO, still lying 10 feet away, that was a different kind of knowledge. The afternoon brought someone unexpected. Marcus Reed, her executive assistant for 7 years. The man who managed her schedule, screened her calls, prepared her briefing documents. The person she saw more than anyone else in her professional life and knew almost nothing about. His footsteps were different from the board members. Quieter. He didn't approach the bed immediately. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute. Then he moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down. For a long time he said nothing. Victoria could hear him breathing steady and controlled. Finally, his voice broke the silence, pitched low and careful. He wasn't sure if she could hear him. He knew the doctors said she was in a coma, knew that speaking to her might be pointless, but he wanted to talk anyway. The office felt wrong without her. People were whispering in corners, making plans, positioning themselves for whatever came next. He paused, then continued. The board had approached him yesterday. They wanted him to sign a statement confirming her erratic behavior in the weeks before the accident. They'd framed it as helping establish a timeline, as assisting with the transition. Marcus had refused. He told them he worked for Victoria Ashford, not for them. They'd called him difficult. He'd told them he'd rather be difficult than dishonest. Victoria's carefully controlled calm wavered. She'd hired Marcus because his resume showed competence, and his interview showed no signs of the ego that plagued so many assistants. She'd never asked about his personal life, never inquired about the gap in his employment history or the reason he'd left his previous career. She just needed someone reliable, and he'd proven reliable every single day for 7 years. She'd never considered what that reliability cost him. Marcus kept talking. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. He told her a story she'd never known about the months after his wife died. Emily had been 6 months old, and Marcus had been a licensed electrician working for a commercial HVAC contractor. Good job, steady pay, flexible enough that he could manage daycare pickups. Then Sarah got sick. Breast cancer, aggressive and fast. She was gone in 8 months. After that, Marcus had tried to keep working, tried to maintain his position, prove he could handle it. But emergency call-outs don't respect daycare hours. Client sites don't accommodate babies. His supervisor had been sympathetic right up until the third time Marcus had to leave a job site early. Then came the conversation about reliability, about commitment, about whether this was really the right fit anymore. Marcus had spent 4 months applying to office positions, administrative work, scheduling anything that offered regular hours and didn't require crawling through ceiling spaces or climbing utility poles. 47 applications. 47 rejections, most of them polite, some brutally direct. Single father with an infant. Too much risk of absences. Too many potential complications. Then he'd walked into Victoria's office for an interview at Ashford Technologies. She'd looked at his resume for maybe 90 seconds, asked 3 questions about his project management experience and technical background, and hired him on the spot. When he'd tried to explain about Emily, about the childcare arrangements he'd need to maintain, Victoria had cut him off. His personal life was his business. She only cared whether he could do the work. Could he? He'd told her yes. She'd told him to start Monday. Marcus's voice roughened at the edges. That conversation had changed everything. After months of being treated like a liability, like a problem waiting to happen, Victoria had looked at him and seen competence. She hadn't offered sympathy or made allowances or treated him like a charity case. She'd expected him to succeed. That expectation had been worth more than any kindness. Victoria felt something crack inside her, a fissure in the armor she'd maintained for so long. She'd hired Marcus because she needed an assistant and his qualifications were solid. She'd kept him because he did excellent work. She'd never thought about what that job meant to him, what those 7 years of steady employment and reliable income had provided for him and his daughter. She'd never realized that treating someone fairly, expecting them to meet high standards without making their personal struggles a point of discussion, could be its own form of generosity. Marcus stood up. He had to pick up Emily from school. He'd come back tomorrow. Before he left, he said one more thing, quiet enough that Victoria almost missed it. He didn't know if she could hear him, didn't know if she'd ever wake up, but if she could hear him somehow, he wanted her to know he wasn't going anywhere. The board could pressure him all they wanted. He wouldn't help them take her company. She'd stood by him when he was a single father nobody wanted to hire. He would stand by her now. The door closed behind him. Victoria lay in the sudden silence, her mind working through equations that had nothing to do with business. She'd built her entire career on the assumption that loyalty was transactional. People stayed because you paid them well, because you offered them opportunities, because leaving would cost them something. She'd never considered that someone might stay simply because you'd treated them like a human being, capable of meeting expectations rather than a problem to be managed. The evening brought more visitors. Technical staff from the company, mid-level managers who'd worked with her on various projects. They said the appropriate things, expressed the appropriate sentiments, and left quickly. Victoria barely registered them. Her mind was still turning over Marcus's words, examining them from different angles, finding new implications each time. By the third day, a rhythm had established itself. Morning checks from the nurse's vitals stable, no change. Afternoon visits from board members who spent less time at her bedside and more time in the hallway making calls. Marcus in the late afternoon, always after 3:30, which she realized must be when he picked up Emily from school. He'd talk for 20 minutes sometimes about work, sometimes about his daughter, sometimes about nothing in particular. Emily was 8 years old now. She'd been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 5, which meant insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors and constant vigilance. Marcus mentioned checking his phone during meetings, making sure the readings were stable, always aware that a malfunction or a miscalculation could turn dangerous fast. He said it matter-of-factly, the way people discuss challenges they've learned to integrate into daily life. Victoria had never known any of this. In 7 years of daily interaction, she'd never asked about Emily's health. never inquired about Marcus's life outside the office. She'd thought she was respecting his privacy. Now she wondered if she'd just been avoiding connection, maintaining the distance that felt safer than engagement. On the 5th day, Marcus arrived looking haggard. He dropped into the chair beside her bed with visible exhaustion. Emily's insulin pump had malfunctioned the night before. The backup alarm had woken them at 2 in the morning, her blood sugar dropping into dangerous territory. He'd spent 3 hours getting it stabilized, replacing the pump site monitoring her closely. She was fine now, but they needed a new pump. The insurance covered 80%, which left $1,600 out of pocket. The continuous glucose monitor sensors were another $400 a month that insurance didn't cover. His voice went flat as he laid out the numbers. His health insurance came through Ashford Technologies. The company plan was excellent, covered most of Emily's needs, made the diabetes manageable instead of financially catastrophic. If he lost his job, he'd have 60 days of COBRA coverage before everything lapsed. 60 days to find new employment with comparable benefits, or 60 days to figure out how to afford Emily's medical supplies out of pocket. Marcus stopped talking. The silence stretched. Then he said, quiet and firm, that he couldn't sign the board's statement. He couldn't lie about Victoria's judgment or her competence. He'd figure something out about Emily, about the insurance, about whatever came next. But he wouldn't betray Victoria to keep his job. Victoria wanted to scream. She wanted to sit up, rip the ventilator tube from her throat, tell Marcus he was an idiot, tell him to sign whatever they wanted, protect his daughter. But she stayed frozen, trapped in her own strategy, and listened to Marcus destroy his financial security rather than betray someone who'd never even asked about his daughter's health. The guilt sat heavy in her chest. She'd hired him, fairly paid him well-expected excellence without making his personal life a point of discussion. She'd thought that was enough. She'd thought that was generosity. Now she understood the difference between treating someone with professional respect and actually seeing them as a complete person. She'd done the first. She'd failed entirely at the second. Marcus left, and Victoria lay alone with the knowledge that her silence was causing real damage to someone who'd never done anything except his job and maintained his integrity. She tested her strength again. She could bend her elbows now, could flex her wrists. Her legs were responding, better knees bending when she concentrated. Maybe another 3 days and she'd have enough control to sit up convincingly. But by then, what damage would be done? The 6th day brought a new development. Richard came to her room alone, which was unusual. He stood beside her bed for a long moment, just looking at her. Then he leaned close enough that she could hear him breathing. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the sympathy he performed for the board. He said he knew she could hear him, said it directly, like a statement of fact rather than speculation. He knew she was aware, knew she was listening, knew she understood everything happening around her. He found it poetic watching her lie there helpless while her company was dismantled. Douglas was his father. Richard said it plainly, confirming what Victoria had already deduced. She'd destroyed Douglas Crane with her acquisition, used lawyers and strategic maneuvers to outplay him at every turn. Then she'd made sure no one in Silicon Valley would touch him, blackballing him from the industry so completely that he couldn't find work anywhere. Douglas had spiraled into depression, isolated, and broke until one day Richard came home from UC Berkeley and found his father hanging in their garage. Richard's voice never wavered. He'd been 22 years old, cutting his father down, calling 911, knowing it was already too late. And at the funeral, people had said Douglas shouldn't have challenged Victoria Ashford. They'd made her the hero and his father the cautionary tale. So Richard had spent 10 years planning, joined her board, waited patiently, built his position. And now, watching her lie helpless in a hospital bed while he took everything she'd built, he felt something close to justice. Tomorrow, Richard said there would be an emergency board meeting. They'd vote to remove her as CEO. Marcus Reed would sign the statement, or Marcus would watch his daughter suffer without insurance. Richard had done his homework. He knew about Emily's diabetes, knew about the costs, knew exactly where to apply pressure. People always broke when you threatened their children. He straightened up, adjusted his tie, and left the room. Victoria lay frozen, her heart rate spiking before she forced it back under control. Tomorrow. The board would meet tomorrow, vote tomorrow, remove her tomorrow. And Marcus, who'd refused to compromise his integrity for his own sake, would be forced to choose between his daughter's health and his loyalty to someone who'd never given him anything except a job and fair treatment. She'd gathered her information. She'd seen who would betray her and who would stand firm. But she'd miscalculated. She'd assumed she'd have time to plan her return time to prepare her counterattack. Richard wasn't giving her time. He was moving tomorrow, and she wasn't ready. Victoria tested her body again. Arms responded stronger now. Legs moved, though they'd be shaky if she tried to stand. Core muscles were the weakest, would make sitting up difficult. She could probably manage it, could probably rip the ventilator tube out and prove she was conscious. But then what? She'd be confused, disoriented, possibly combative. Richard would spin it as temporary consciousness, would say she wasn't competent to make decisions. The board would vote anyway, would cite medical necessity, would do exactly what they'd planned with the added justification that she'd proven unstable. She needed a better moment, needed to time it perfectly, catch them mid-betrayal, undeniable proof that she was not only conscious, but fully aware of everything they'd done. But that meant waiting until the meeting started, waiting until they began the vote, waiting until Marcus was put on the spot with his daughter's health in the balance. The night stretched long and dark. Victoria lay awake in her hospital bed, listening to the ventilator's rhythm, weighing impossible choices. She'd spent 14 years making hard decisions. She'd destroyed competitors, outmaneuvered rivals, built a company worth $800 million through ruthless pragmatism. But every decision had been about business, about strategy, about winning games played with money and market share. This was different. This decision would cost Marcus, would cost Emily, would exact a price from people who'd never signed up to be collateral damage in her war with Richard Crane. She could end it now, could wake up and fight from a position of weakness, or she could wait, let the trap spring completely, and accept that people would be hurt in the process. Victoria had built her empire on the principle that you did what was necessary to win. The cost was irrelevant if the outcome was victory. But lying in this hospital bed, stripped of her power and her armor, she wasn't sure that principle still held. She wasn't sure the woman who'd believed that so completely still existed. The morning of the 9th day arrived with California sunlight slanting through her window. Nurses came early for their checks, commenting to each other about how stable she was, how remarkable it was that her vitals remained so steady. They had no idea she'd spent a week learning to control every autonomic function they monitored. Marcus arrived at 7:45, 2 hours earlier than usual. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie slightly crooked. He sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed and put his face in his hands. Emily's blood sugar had dropped to 55 during the night. Dangerous territory, the kind of low that could cause seizures if it went much lower. He'd caught it early, thank God had gotten glucose into her system, and watched her climb back to normal ranges. But she'd been scared, had asked him in that way children do, direct and without artifice, what would happen if he lost his job. He'd told her everything would be fine, but he didn't know if that was true. The board meeting was at 10. Marcus had received a formal summons to provide testimony about Victoria's state of mind in the weeks before the accident. They wanted him to confirm instability, erratic judgment decisions that showed impaired thinking. They'd prepared the statement. All he had to do was sign. Marcus lifted his head, looked at Victoria's closed eyes, her motionless face. He said he was sorry. He'd tried to protect her, tried to buy her time, but Richard had outmaneuvered him at every turn. The vote would happen within hours. Marcus would have to choose between his daughter's insulin and his integrity, and he wasn't sure what choice he could live with. He stood up, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. He said he didn't know if Victoria could hear him, but he hoped she could. He wanted her to know she'd given him dignity when everyone else offered pity. She'd seen him as capable when everyone else saw complications. He'd never forgotten that, would never forget it, even if circumstances forced him to make choices he couldn't defend. The door closed. Victoria lay in the silence, making her final calculations. The board would meet at 10 in the administrative conference room. Richard would be confident, certain of his victory. Margaret would second his motions. David would abstain, too weak to oppose but too guilty to actively support. And Marcus would be forced into an impossible position, his daughter's health held hostage to his loyalty. She had perhaps 2 hours to regain enough strength to move. 2 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would require every ounce of control she'd built over the past 9 days. 2 hours to decide if she was still the woman who'd built an empire on ruthless pragmatism, or if something fundamental had shifted during her week of forced observation. The physical therapist arrived at 8:30 for passive range of motion exercises. Janet, a woman in her 50s who chatted cheerfully while manipulating Victoria's limbs, bending her arms and legs to prevent muscle atrophy. She had no idea Victoria was conscious. Had no idea these exercises were the only thing keeping Victoria's muscles from complete deterioration. Victoria used the session, letting Janet move her limbs while she focused on reconnecting the neural pathways, on strengthening the signals between brain and body. After Janet left, Victoria spent another hour alone testing herself. She could curl her fingers into fists now, could bend her arms at the elbow, lift them a few inches off the bed. Her legs responded, knees bending, feet flexing. Sitting up would be the hard part. Core muscles weakened by 9 days of stillness would have to support her entire upper body. She tried once pushing with her arms, engaging her abdominals, made it 6 inches before the muscles screamed in protest. Not enough. She tried again, managed 8 inches. Her arms shook with the effort. By 9:30 she could get to a 40-degree angle before exhaustion forced her back down. It would have to be enough. She wouldn't be walking into that boardroom, wouldn't be standing tall and commanding. But she could sit up. She could pull the ventilator tube from her throat. She could make them see that she was awake, aware, and coming for this. At 9:50 she heard footsteps in the corridor. Multiple people moving together. The board members heading to the conference room 2 floors up. Richard's voice carried confident and calm. He was saying something about keeping the meeting brief, about making the announcement before noon. Victoria waited, counted heartbeats, focused on keeping her breathing steady, her vitals unremarkable. The nurses would do their 10 o'clock rounds in 15 minutes. If she timed this wrong, they'd sedate her, would call it a medical emergency, would give Richard exactly the chaos he needed to justify his takeover. At 10:05, she heard rapid footsteps. Marcus nearly running, reaching her room out of breath. He didn't sit down this time. He stood beside her bed, words tumbling out in a rush. The board had moved up the vote. They were voting right now, this minute, in the conference room upstairs. Richard claimed they'd waited long enough, that market instability required immediate action. They'd demanded Marcus come to the meeting to provide his statement about Victoria's condition. Richard had prepared documentation. Marcus just had to sign to confirm she showed no signs of recovery, that doctors indicated she might never wake up. If he signed, he could keep his job, keep his insurance, keep Emily safe. If he refused, Richard would have him removed from the building immediately. Marcus's voice cracked. He'd walked out instead of answering. He'd come here because he didn't know what else to do, where else to go. The vote would finish in minutes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Victoria made her decision. She'd gathered enough information. She'd seen enough betrayal, enough loyalty, enough truth. It was time to end this. She opened her eyes. Marcus jerked backward, shock blanking his face. Victoria blinked, adjusting to light that felt too bright after 9 days of closed lids. She could see him clearly, now could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the fear and confusion warring in his expression. She tried to speak, but the ventilator tube blocked her throat. She reached up with her right hand, moving slowly, deliberately, and wrapped her fingers around the tube. Marcus realized what she was doing, lunged for the call button on the bed rail. He was telling her to wait, to let medical staff handle it. Victoria didn't wait. She'd been waiting for 9 days. She pulled the tube from her throat in one smooth motion, the sensation brutal and necessary. She dropped it on the bed and drew her first breath of unassisted air, coughing as her throat protested the sudden freedom. Her voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. She said Marcus's name. He stared at her like she was a ghost made solid. She said it again, stronger this time, then forced out the words that mattered. She'd heard everything. She knew what Richard was doing. She was awake, and she wasn't letting them take her company. The door burst open. 2 nurses rushed in, followed immediately by Dr. Chen. They saw Victoria sitting up the ventilator tube discarded and froze for 1 critical second. Then training overrode shock. Dr. Chen moved to her side, checking her pupils, her pulse firing questions. Could she hear him? Did she know where she was? What was her name? Victoria answered each question clearly, directly. She'd been conscious for 9 days. She'd chosen to remain silent. She told him she understood this sounded impossible, but he'd see the proof when he reviewed the data properly. The locked-in syndrome he'd been about to test for with an MRI, she'd been managing it herself, controlling her vitals to mimic a coma state. Dr. Chen looked stunned, but he continued his examination. 1 nurse left the room quickly, presumably to inform administration. Victoria turned her attention to Marcus, who still stood frozen beside her bed. She told him to go upstairs. Told him to tell Richard and the board she was awake and coming to the meeting. Marcus hesitated, then nodded and left at a run. Dr. Chen tried to insist Victoria stay in bed, undergo more tests before moving. Victoria told him she appreciated his concern, but she had a meeting to attend. She'd been lying in this bed for 9 days, listening to people try to dismantle her life's work. She was done listening. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the doctor's protests. Her muscles screamed as she forced them to support her weight. She stood, gripping the bed rail for balance, and took a step. Her legs held. She took another. The weakness was profound, her body protesting every movement, but she could do this. She could walk. The remaining nurse brought a wheelchair. Victoria started to refuse, then reconsidered. Pride was expensive, and she didn't have energy to waste. She lowered herself into the chair, keeping her back straight, her expression controlled. The doctor stayed close, still trying to convince her this was medically inadvisable. Victoria told him to come along if he was worried, but she was going to that conference room, whether he cleared it or not. The elevator ride seemed to take forever. Dr. Chen stood beside her wheelchair, his face a mixture of medical concern and something that might have been respect. When the doors opened on the administrative floor, Victoria could hear voices from the conference room at the end of the hall. Richard's voice confident and commanding, moving the meeting forward with practiced efficiency. She directed the nurse to wheel her down the corridor. Each rotation of the wheels brought her closer to the confrontation she'd been building toward for 9 days. She'd lain silent, gathering ammunition, watching her enemies reveal themselves. Now came the accounting. Through the glass panel in the conference room door, she could see them. Richard standing at the head of the table holding papers. Margaret seated to his right, her expression professionally neutral. David and the other board members scattered along the sides. Marcus near the door, his back to the glass shoulders tense. Richard was talking about Victoria's legacy, about protecting what she'd built, about ensuring shareholder value through this difficult transition. His voice carried that particular blend of gravity and resolve that people used when they wanted to sound responsible while doing something self-serving. Victoria told the nurse to open the door. The nurse hesitated, looking at Dr. Chen. The doctor studied Victoria's face for a long moment, then nodded. The nurse pushed the door open. The room went completely silent. Every head turned toward the doorway. Richard's expression cycled through irritation, recognition, and something that looked like fear. Margaret's eyes went wide. The other board members simply stared. Marcus turned, saw Victoria sitting in the wheelchair, and the relief that crossed his face was so raw it was almost painful to witness. Victoria had the nurse wheel her into the room. She positioned herself at the opposite end of the table from Richard, the symbolic head of the table where she'd always sat. She was wearing a hospital gown, had an oxygen cannula in her nose, looked like she'd been through a car accident and 9 days in a coma. But her eyes were clear, her voice steady when she spoke. She'd been conscious for 9 days, she told them. Every conversation, every scheme, every betrayal, she'd heard it all. She looked at each board member in turn, letting them see that she was fully aware, fully present, fully in control, despite the wheelchair and the hospital gown. Richard tried to recover his composure, tried to suggest she was confused, that she'd been through trauma and her perception might be compromised. Victoria cut him off. Her perception was fine. She'd heard him threaten Marcus. She'd heard him mention his father, Douglas Crane. She'd heard him plan to take her company while she was supposedly unconscious. Richard started to deflect, to spin the Douglas connection as coincidence. Victoria didn't let him. His father was Douglas Crane, CEO of Crane Tech, the company she'd acquired 10 years ago. Richard had spent 5 years on her board planning revenge-building position, waiting for an opportunity exactly like this. Richard's face drained of color, then flushed red. He opened his mouth closed, it opened it again. The calculated composure he'd maintained for 5 years cracked visibly. Margaret shifted in her seat, suddenly finding the conference table fascinating. David Wells looked between Victoria and Richard like he was watching a collision in slow motion. Victoria didn't give Richard time to recover. She addressed the full board, her voice carrying despite the rasp in her throat. They'd been about to vote her out based on false testimony and manufactured evidence. They'd been willing to dismantle 14 years of leadership because Richard Crane told them a story that confirmed their fears about market instability. She wanted to know which of them had actually verified anything Richard claimed, which of them had done their fiduciary duty instead of taking the easy path. Silence answered her. Margaret finally spoke, her voice thin. They'd all been relieved to see Victoria awake. Of course, the vote should be postponed now that she was able to respond to concerns. David nodded quickly, murmuring agreement. The other board members made similar noises, sudden enthusiasm for delay now that their target was sitting upright and staring at them. Richard stood isolated at his end of the table, his carefully constructed coup evaporating in real time. Victoria watched him struggle for a response, saw him trying to find an angle that would salvage something from this disaster. He finally managed to suggest this was highly irregular, that Victoria clearly wasn't well, that medical evaluation should happen before any business discussions. Victoria met his eyes directly. She'd been evaluated. Dr. Chen was standing right outside the door if Richard wanted a medical opinion. But they weren't here to discuss her health. They were here because Richard had called an emergency meeting to remove her as CEO while she was supposedly in a coma. That meeting was now concluded, the vote invalid, and she was resuming her position immediately. She turned to Marcus, who'd remained silent near the door through the entire exchange. His loyalty and integrity had protected not just her position, but the entire company. She'd failed to recognize his value properly for 7 years. That ended now. Effective immediately, Marcus Reed was promoted to Chief of Staff with full authority to act on her behalf. The board would respect his decisions as they would respect hers. Marcus looked stunned, started to protest that he wasn't qualified, that he was just an assistant. Victoria cut him off. He'd faced down a boardroom of people with far more money and power, refused to compromise his integrity even when threatened with his daughter's health. That was more qualification than most executives ever demonstrated. The question was whether he'd take the job, not whether he deserved it. Marcus's throat worked. He managed a single word. Yes. Victoria nodded, then addressed Richard directly. His position on the board was terminated immediately. He'd violated his fiduciary duty, attempted to manipulate company records, conspired to remove her through false pretenses. He could leave voluntarily or she'd have security escort him out. Richard's composure shattered completely. His voice rose sharp and bitter. This wasn't over. She couldn't just erase 5 years of board service. He had rights, he had lawyers, he had resources. Victoria let him finish, then delivered the rest. She knew about the shell companies. She knew he held 26% of Ashford Technologies through hidden ownership structures never disclosed to the SEC as required. That was securities fraud. He could leave now and sell those shares quietly, or she'd file a criminal complaint. The room went silent again. Margaret's face had gone pale. Richard stood frozen, clearly trying to calculate his options. Victoria gave him 10 seconds, then gestured to the door. Security was already on their way. Marcus had called them before entering the conference room, anticipating exactly this moment. Richard grabbed his papers and briefcase. He shot Victoria one last look, pure hatred distilled to its essence. His father was a better person than she'd ever be. Victoria didn't flinch. Maybe so, but his father was a worse businessman, and sometimes that mattered more. Richard left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The remaining board members sat in uncomfortable silence. Victoria addressed them briefly. Margaret had 48 hours to resign. David was on probation. The others would face new oversight protocols, complete transparency, no more votes without full vetting. If they didn't like it, they could follow Richard out the door. Margaret stood immediately, her resignation already forming on her lips. She'd be gone by end of business today. She gathered her materials and left without further comment. The remaining board members murmured acceptance of the new terms. Victoria dismissed them. She needed to return to her hospital room before her body gave out entirely. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading fast. As soon as the board members filed out, Victoria felt the weakness rush back in. Her hands started shaking. Marcus noticed, immediately moved to her side. He asked if she needed help getting back to her room. Victoria admitted she probably did. The wheelchair suddenly felt necessary rather than strategic. Marcus took the handles from the nurse, told Dr. Chen they were ready to go back. The doctor, who'd watched the entire confrontation with an expression somewhere between medical concern and fascination, simply nodded and led the way. They made it to the elevator before Victoria's vision started to gray at the edges. She gripped the wheelchair arms, forcing herself to stay conscious. Marcus noticed his voice sharp with concern. She needed to get back to bed immediately. Victoria didn't argue. She'd accomplished what she'd needed to. The rest could wait until her body remembered how to function properly. Back in her hospital room, the staff reconnected monitors and ran tests. Victoria's heart rate was elevated, blood pressure dropping. Dr. Chen's earlier concern shifted to outright alarm. What she'd done was medically reckless, could have caused serious complications. She needed rest fluids and at least 72 hours of observation before she'd be cleared for any activity. Victoria agreed to everything. She'd won. She could afford to rest now. As the medical team worked around her, administering IV fluids and adjusting equipment, she let her eyes close. Not pretending this time. Actually resting. 3 days passed in a blur of medical procedures, physical therapy sessions, and visits from company executives who needed to see with their own eyes that she was awake and functional. David Wells came to apologize, looking genuinely remorseful. He should have opposed Richard from the start, should have trusted his instincts. Victoria told him trust was earned through action, not words. He had a chance to prove himself now. Cyber Shield acquisition paperwork came through on the 4th day. The deal she'd been pushing before the accident, the one Richard had opposed as too risky, was complete. Early indicators showed strong integration, the acquired team meshing well with existing departments. Shareholders were pleased. Victoria had been right about the strategic value. Marcus visited every afternoon now, bringing work materials instead of just sitting beside her bed. They reviewed pending decisions, discussed staffing changes, planned the restructuring of the board. He'd moved into his new role with the same quiet competence he'd shown as her assistant, the only difference being that now people listened when he spoke. On the 5th day, Marcus arrived with Emily. The girl hung back near the door, clutching a stuffed elephant, her eyes wide as she took in the hospital room and its occupant. Marcus made the introduction. Emily, this was Ms. Ashford. She was the one who'd made sure he kept his job. Victoria corrected him gently. He'd kept his own job by being brave. She'd just recognized it. Emily studied her with the directness children have, unfiltered and assessing. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for being her daddy's friend." He didn't have many friends. The words landed harder than they should have. Victoria looked at Marcus, something passing between them in that moment. She didn't have many friends either. The admission felt strange, coming out acknowledging a loneliness she'd told herself was professional necessity. Emily noticed the watch on Victoria's wrist, the vintage mechanical piece that had belonged to her father. The girl said it was pretty. Victoria unclasped it without thinking, held it out. Her father had given her this watch when she'd graduated from MIT. It was the only thing she had from him. Would Emily hold on to it for her until she got out of the hospital? Emily's eyes went wide. She looked to Marcus, who nodded permission, then took the watch with reverent care. She promised to take good care of it, cradling it like something precious and fragile. Marcus's eyes had gone suspiciously bright. He managed to keep his voice steady as he thanked her, but Victoria could hear the emotion underneath. They stayed for another hour. Emily told Victoria about school, about her diabetes management, about the stray cat she'd been feeding behind their apartment complex. Marcus let her talk only occasionally, redirecting when she started to veer into stories that would take too long. When they finally left, Emily waved goodbye with the hand not holding Victoria's watch. Victoria sat in the sudden quiet, processing what had just happened. She'd given away her father's watch. The only physical connection she had to him, handed over to an 8-year-old girl she'd just met. The impulse made no logical sense. But watching Emily's face light up, seeing Marcus struggle with unexpected emotion, it had felt exactly right. Dr. Chen cleared her for discharge on day 14. She'd regained most of her strength, could walk unassisted, no longer needed supplemental oxygen. Physical therapy would continue outpatient 3 times a week for the next month. He warned her about pushing too hard, about recognizing her body's limits. Victoria promised to be careful, knowing she'd probably ignore that advice the moment work demanded it. Marcus arrived to drive her home. Not a company car, she noticed. His personal vehicle, a Honda Accord that had seen better years. She didn't comment on it, just let him help her into the passenger seat. The gesture of using his own car instead of something corporate felt significant, though she couldn't quite articulate why. They drove through afternoon traffic, Marcus navigating with the ease of someone who'd made this route hundreds of times. Victoria watched San Francisco slide past her window, familiar and somehow foreign after 2 weeks of seeing nothing but hospital walls. The city looked the same. She was the one who'd changed. Marcus broke the silence first. What happened now? With the company, with the board, with the restructuring they'd discussed. Victoria outlined the plan. New board members, people with actual operational experience instead of just capital. Stricter oversight protocols. Complete transparency in all major decisions. No more votes held in secret or rushed through without proper vetting. Marcus nodded, then clarified. He'd meant with her, not the company, her. Victoria paused, watching traffic slow ahead of them. She'd spent 14 years building walls, believing trust was weakness, maintaining distance as protection. Then she'd been forced to lie completely vulnerable, stripped of every defense, and observe what people really were. Most of the people she'd hired, promoted, worked alongside, they'd been ready to discard her the moment she couldn't fight back. But not Marcus. He'd been the only one. The only person who'd refused to compromise, refused to calculate odds, refused to put his own survival above basic integrity. She'd hired him because his resume showed competence. She'd kept him because he did excellent work. She'd never thought about what those 7 years meant to him, what that steady paycheck and respect provided beyond just income. Marcus waited, giving her space to work through her thoughts. Finally, Victoria said she was going to try something different. She was going to trust people, starting with him. He smiled at that, a small expression that changed his whole face. Trust was a good place to start. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. 2 months later, Ashford Technologies held its quarterly earnings call. Victoria stood at the podium, Marcus beside her in his capacity as chief of staff. The numbers were strong. Cyber Shield integration had exceeded projections, the combined company showing synergies nobody had anticipated. Shareholders were pleased. The analysts who'd predicted instability after her accident were quietly revising their assessments. Afterward, there was a small celebration in the main office. Nothing elaborate, just the executive team and key department heads. Emily was there, brought in by Marcus, despite it being a Saturday. She still wore Victoria's watch, though Marcus had mentioned several times that she should give it back. Victoria had told him the watch looked better on Emily anyway. David Wells approached, carrying a glass of champagne he clearly needed for courage. He wanted to thank her for giving him another chance. He hadn't deserved it, hadn't earned it through his actions. Victoria corrected him. Thank Marcus. He'd been the one to convince her that people could learn from mistakes, that one failure didn't define someone's character permanently. David looked at Marcus with visible respect. They talked briefly about the new board composition, about the candidates being vetted. David had suggestions, people he'd worked with who had the kind of operational experience Victoria wanted. He was trying to prove himself valuable, trying to justify her decision to keep him on. Victoria noticed the other changes too. Employees greeted her by name, now stopped to chat about small things. She knew which of them had children, who was dealing with aging parents who'd just bought a house. The information had always been available in HR files. She'd just never thought it mattered before. Marcus caught her attention from across the room, gestured toward the door. Emily was getting tired, needed to head home. Victoria nodded, then walked over to say goodbye. Emily hugged her waist unexpectedly, the watch glinting on her small wrist. She said she was glad Ms. Ashford was okay, that her daddy seemed happier now, out of the mouths of children. Victoria returned the hug, told Emily she'd see her soon. Marcus thanked her for letting them come, gathered his daughter's things, and headed out. Victoria watched them go, father and daughter easy with each other, in a way she'd never experienced with her own parents. Later that evening, Victoria sat in her office after everyone else had left. The city lights spread out below her windows. San Francisco. At dusk, she pulled up the file on her computer, the one she'd been reviewing for the past week. Richard Crane's shell company documentation, the ownership structures he'd built so carefully, the securities violations that would have put him in federal prison if she'd followed through with criminal charges. She'd let him walk away instead, let him sell his shares, sever his connection to the company, disappear into whatever life people built after their revenge schemes collapsed. She could have destroyed him the way he'd tried to destroy her. The old Victoria would have. But the old Victoria had believed power was the only currency that mattered, that trust was transactional, that maintaining distance was the same as maintaining control. 2 weeks in a hospital bed, 9 days pretending to be unconscious, had taught her the limitations of that philosophy. Power without connection was just isolation with better furniture. Her phone buzzed. Marcus texting from his car. Emily wanted Victoria to come to her birthday party next month. She'd be turning 9, would be crushed if Victoria couldn't make it. Was she free the Saturday afternoon of the 23rd? Victoria checked her calendar. She had a meeting with potential board candidates that morning scheduled to run until early afternoon. She could move, it could reschedule, could make time for a 9-year-old's birthday party if she chose to. The old Victoria wouldn't have. Would have sent a gift with an apologetic note about prior commitments. She typed back. What time should she arrive? Marcus responded immediately. 2 o'clock, and Emily had already decided Victoria should bring her own slice of cake to cut since she'd missed doing that when she was in the hospital. Victoria smiled at that, at the child's logic that everyone deserved birthday cake, even at someone else's party. She'd be there, she confirmed. Marcus sent back a thumbs-up emoji, followed by a thank you that carried more weight than 2 words should. Victoria set her phone down and returned her attention to the window, to the city lights and the evening traffic and the life happening outside her office walls. For the first time in 14 years, she felt like she was actually part of it, instead of just observing from a distance. The feeling was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and strangely compelling. She'd built an empire on control and calculation. Maybe it was time to build something on connection instead. The night deepened. Victoria worked through emails, reviewed acquisition proposals, made notes on the board restructuring. But her mind kept circling back to Marcus's words from 2 months ago, spoken in her hospital room when she'd been weak and medically fragile. He'd told her a story about a man who couldn't find work because people saw his circumstances instead of his capabilities. About a woman who'd hired him anyway, not out of charity, but out of standards. About how that simple act of treating someone as competent had changed everything. She'd never thought her hiring practices were particularly noteworthy. She'd just wanted qualified people who could do the work. But Marcus had taught her that fairness, consistent and unadorned, was its own form of generosity in a world that constantly judged people by their complications rather than their abilities. He'd stayed loyal through a crisis that could have destroyed him financially, stayed loyal to someone who'd never asked about his daughter's health or acknowledged his struggles. The old Victoria would have seen that loyalty as transactional, as something she'd purchased with a salary and job security. The new Victoria understood it was something far more valuable and far more fragile. It was the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought, only earned through years of fair treatment and basic respect. She'd stumbled into earning it without meaning to, by simply expecting excellence, without caring about personal circumstances that didn't affect work quality. A notification popped up on her screen. David Wells had sent through his recommendations for new board candidates, along with detailed notes on each person's operational background and areas of expertise. 3 women, 2 men, all with 20+ years of actual business experience. No more venture capitalists with inherited money and revenge agendas. Victoria reviewed the files, making notes. She'd call each candidate personally, conduct preliminary interviews herself. The board Richard had manipulated was gone. Margaret had resigned as promised. 2 others had chosen to leave rather than accept the new transparency requirements. Victoria was rebuilding from the ground up, and this time she'd get it right. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus apologizing for the double text, but Emily couldn't sleep without thanking Victoria for letting her keep the watch. She'd been worried about it, apparently concerned that Victoria would want it back or regret giving it away. Could Marcus tell her it was really okay? Victoria called instead of texting. Marcus answered on the second ring, surprise in his voice. She'd wanted to talk to Emily directly, she explained. Marcus put his daughter on the line. Emily's voice was small, uncertain. She was really sorry if she shouldn't have kept the watch. She'd tried to take good care of it, checked it every day to make sure it was still working. If Ms. Ashford wanted it back, she understood. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. The watch had belonged to her father, given to her at graduation, carried through 14 years of building a company. It was the only physical connection she had to him, the only thing she'd kept when she'd sold her mother's house and donated everything else. By any logical measure, she should want it back. But listening to Emily's worried voice, hearing the care and concern over a piece of machinery that meant nothing to an 8-year-old except that an adult had trusted her with something important, Victoria knew she'd made the right choice. The watch had value because her father had given it to her. Now it had value because she'd given it to Emily. The chain of care and trust extended forward instead of just backward. She told Emily the watch was hers now. A gift, not a loan. Her only request was that Emily take care of it, and maybe someday when she was older, pass it on to someone who needed to know they were trusted with something valuable. Emily's delighted squeal was loud enough that Victoria had to pull the phone away from her ear. She heard Marcus in the background, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to hide. Emily promised to take care of it forever, thanked Victoria 3 times in rapid succession, then handed the phone back to her father. Marcus cleared his throat. He didn't know what to say. That was too generous, too much. Emily would treasure it, but he hadn't expected Victoria to actually give away something that meaningful. Victoria cut him off. The watch was just metal and gears. What made it valuable was the memory of her father trusting her with it, believing she'd take care of it properly. Emily would create her own memories, now her own sense of being trusted with something important. That was worth more than keeping it locked in a drawer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very simply that Victoria Ashford was not the person people thought she was. She was better, more human, more real. The words hit harder than they should have. Victoria managed a response, something about still being the same person, just maybe paying attention to different things now. Marcus laughed, soft and disbelieving. No, she was different. Lying in that hospital bed, stripped of power and authority, forced to observe instead of command, that had changed something fundamental. He could see it in how she interacted with employees, how she made decisions, how she'd given his daughter a watch that meant everything to her, just to make an 8-year-old feel special. Victoria ended the call a few minutes later after extracting a promise from Marcus that Emily would actually sleep now instead of staying up all night, excited about the watch. She set her phone down and stared at it for a while, processing the conversation. Marcus was right. She had changed. The woman who'd built Ashford Technologies on ruthless pragmatism and careful distance wouldn't recognize the woman who'd just given away her father's watch to an employee's child. But that woman had also been lying alone in a hospital bed, convinced she was surrounded by enemies and potential betrayers. That woman had missed the one person who'd been loyal all along because she'd been too busy protecting herself to notice who actually deserved trust. The city lights had shifted while she'd been on the phone, moving from dusk into full evening. Victoria saved her work, shut down her computer, and gathered her things. For once, she was going home at a reasonable hour. For once, she had plans that didn't involve work emails or acquisition proposals. She had a birthday party to prepare for a 9-year-old, to celebrate a connection, to honor that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with being human. In the parking garage, Victoria's Tesla sat where Marcus had parked it 2 months ago, recovered from the accident site and repaired. The insurance company had wanted to total it, but Victoria had insisted on repair. The car had kept her alive through the collision, had protected her enough that she'd survived with injuries that healed. She owed it that much. She drove home through San Francisco streets, following routes she'd driven 1,000 times before. But everything looked different now, sharper, somehow more real. The restaurants where people were having dinner, the couples walking hand in hand, the families with children. She'd spent 14 years driving past all of it, focused on the next meeting, the next deal, the next strategic move. Marcus had asked her what happened now, not with the company, with her. She still didn't have a complete answer to that question. But she was starting to understand that maybe the answer wasn't something she figured out alone in her office. Maybe it was something she discovered by showing up for birthday parties, by trusting people with valuable things, by choosing connection over control. Her phone buzzed one more time. Emily again texting from Marcus's phone, a picture of the watch on her wrist next to her insulin pump. The caption read, "Both keeping me alive. Thank you, Ms. Ashford." The message ended with a string of heart emojis. Victoria saved the picture. She'd spent 14 years collecting very different trophies, signed contracts, acquisition agreements, patents, and proprietary technologies. Those things still mattered, but this mattered too, maybe more. She pulled into her building's garage, parked, took the elevator up to her penthouse apartment. The space was exactly as she'd left it 2 months ago. Clean and minimalist and somehow lifeless despite the expensive furniture and carefully curated art. She'd bought this place 5 years ago, top floor of a newly renovated building, floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the bay. She'd been proud of it then. Now it just felt empty. Victoria walked to the windows, looked out at the water and the lights and the city alive around her. Somewhere out there, Marcus was putting Emily to bed, probably still wearing the watch despite it being past her bedtime. Somewhere out there, Richard Crane was building a new life after his revenge scheme collapsed. Somewhere out there, people were living and struggling and connecting in ways she'd spent 14 years avoiding. She'd learned something lying in that hospital bed, something that couldn't be quantified in quarterly earnings or shareholder value. Power mattered. Success mattered. But they mattered less than she'd thought, and connection mattered more. The people worth keeping weren't the ones who stayed when you had everything to offer. They were the ones who stayed when you had nothing, when you were vulnerable and powerless, and couldn't give them anything except the memory of being treated fairly. Marcus had been that person. The only one in 14 years of building a company and working with hundreds of people. One assistant who'd refused to compromise his integrity, even when threatened with his daughter's health. One person who'd seen her as human rather than just a position. She'd almost missed it. Almost lost him because she'd been so focused on maintaining control that she'd failed to notice who was actually worth trusting. The hospital bed had forced her to stop to observe, to see clearly for the first time. Richard had wanted to destroy her. Instead, he'd accidentally given her perspective she'd never have gained any other way. Victoria pulled out her phone, texted Marcus one more time. Tomorrow morning, she'd need him to block off an hour in her schedule. She wanted to have coffee, just the two of them, not to discuss work, but to talk about how they were going to restructure the company culture from the top down. Fair treatment and high expectations, but also actual recognition of people as complete human beings. She'd stumbled into getting it right with Marcus. Now she wanted to make it systematic, intentional, real. His response came back quickly. He'd have coffee ready in her office at 8. And Victoria. He was glad she was okay. Really glad. Victoria smiled at that, at the genuine care underneath the simple words. She was glad too. Glad she'd survived. Glad she'd learned what she'd needed to learn. Glad she hadn't lost Marcus in the process. The accident had stolen 2 weeks of her life and left her with injuries that still ached. But it had also stripped away every pretense, every defense, every comfortable delusion she'd maintained about power and trust and what actually mattered. She'd built an empire on ruthless pragmatism. Now she was going to run it with something closer to wisdom. The difference would matter, she thought, to Marcus, to Emily, to the employees who deserved better than a CEO who saw them as resources rather than people. And maybe eventually it would matter to her too. The morning of Emily's 9th birthday arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October in San Francisco. Victoria stood in her closet staring at business suits and realizing she had absolutely nothing appropriate for a child's birthday party. Everything was tailored, expensive, designed to project authority. She settled on dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, the most casual items she owned, and felt ridiculous putting them on. Marcus had texted the address 3 days ago. An apartment complex in the outer Sunset, modest buildings with peeling paint and small balconies. The kind of place Victoria drove past without noticing, where working families stretched every paycheck to cover rent and groceries and medical supplies for diabetic daughters. She'd wrapped Emily's gift carefully, a veterinary kit complete with toy stethoscope bandages and a stuffed dog patient. Emily had mentioned wanting to be a veterinarian during that hospital visit, and Victoria remembered the certainty in her voice, the way children declared their futures without doubt or hesitation. The drive took 40 minutes through weekend traffic. Victoria found parking 2 blocks away, walked back carrying the wrapped gift and a bakery box with the slice of birthday cake Emily had requested. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her. The CEO of an $800 million company bringing cake to a 9-year-old's party in a building where the elevator probably didn't work. The elevator didn't work. Victoria climbed 3 flights of stairs, found apartment 3C, and knocked. Children's voices exploded from inside, followed by rapid footsteps. Emily yanked the door open, wearing a purple dress and Victoria's watch. Her face lit up with pure delight. Ms. Ashford came. She'd brought the cake. Wait until everyone saw Emily grabbed Victoria's free hand and pulled her inside. The apartment was small, maybe 800 square feet, with worn furniture and walls that needed paint, but it was clean, organized, lived in. Photos covered the refrigerator. Emily's drawings were tacked to a bulletin board, and a small dining table had been pushed against the wall to make room for folding chairs. Marcus emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that said Grill Master and carrying a tray of cut vegetables. His surprise at seeing Victoria was genuine. She was early. The other parents weren't bringing kids for another hour. Victoria admitted she'd miscalculated traffic had left too much time. Marcus's smile said he understood she was nervous, which was ridiculous but also accurate. Emily dragged Victoria to the couch, wanted to show her something. She produced a photo album, worn leather binding with pages that crackled when turned. Family photos starting with a wedding picture. Marcus looked younger, less weathered. The woman beside him was beautiful dark hair and bright eyes, laughing at something outside the frame. That was Mommy, Emily explained matter-of-factly. She died when Emily was a baby, so Emily didn't really remember her, but Daddy kept all the pictures so Emily could see what she looked like. The girl turned pages showing more photos. Sarah, pregnant. Sarah, holding a newborn. Emily. Sarah in a hospital bed, looking exhausted but happy. Marcus had moved to stand behind the couch, his hand resting on Emily's shoulder. His voice was steady when he spoke. Sarah would have liked Victoria. She'd had a good sense for people who were genuine underneath whatever armor they wore. Victoria didn't know how to respond to that, settled for saying she wished she'd had the chance to meet her. The doorbell rang. More children arrived in clusters, dropped off by parents who clearly knew Marcus well enough to chat briefly at the door. 7 kids, total ages 7 to 10, all girls from Emily's class. They descended on the apartment with chaotic energy, admiring Emily's dress and presents and the elaborate birthday cake Marcus had somehow managed to bake himself. Victoria felt profoundly out of place. She retreated to the kitchen, offered to help Marcus with party logistics. He handed her juice boxes to distribute, accepted her assistance cutting fruit into smaller pieces. They worked in comfortable silence until Marcus finally asked what she was really doing here. Not that he wasn't glad, but this wasn't exactly her usual environment. Victoria admitted she didn't have a usual environment outside of work. She'd spent 14 years building a company, and somewhere in that process she'd stopped having a life that wasn't business meetings and acquisition strategies. Emily had invited her to the party. It seemed important to show up to be the kind of person who kept those commitments. Marcus studied her face. She was trying to figure out how to be different, wasn't she? How to be the person she'd decided to become instead of the person she'd been. Victoria confirmed that assessment. She just wasn't sure she was any good at it yet. "You're here," Marcus pointed out. That was 90% of the work. The rest would come with practice. The party moved to a nearby park for games. Marcus had organized an elaborate scavenger hunt, teams of girls racing around with lists of items to find. Victoria ended up as a team captain, something she definitely hadn't anticipated. 3 9-year-olds looked at her expectantly, waiting for strategy and leadership. Victoria approached it like a business problem. Divided the list into quadrants, assigned each girl a specific area to search, established a meeting point. The girls thought this was brilliant, executed the plan with military precision, and won by finding all items in under 15 minutes. Their victory celebration involved jumping up and down while screaming, which Victoria supposed was the 9-year-old equivalent of quarterly earnings beating projections. Marcus watched from his position, judging the competition, shaking his head with amusement. Of course, Victoria would turn a children's game into a corporate strategy exercise. Of course, her team would win. She couldn't help herself. Victoria felt oddly proud of this, which was absurd. She'd built a cybersecurity company from nothing, had acquired competitors, had created hundreds of jobs. But making 3 9-year-olds happy about finding pine cones and specific colored rocks felt like an achievement on par with any of that. They returned to the apartment for cake and presents. Emily opened gifts with appropriate enthusiasm, thanking each friend sincerely. When she got to Victoria's veterinary kit, her reaction was volcanic. This was exactly what she'd wanted. Exactly. Perfect. She hugged Victoria hard enough to knock the air from her lungs, then spent the next 10 minutes demonstrating on the stuffed dog patient while her friends watched with envy. Marcus caught Victoria's eye across the room, mouthed, "Thank you." Victoria shrugged like it was nothing but the warmth in her chest suggested otherwise. After cake, after singing, after parents collected their children, Victoria helped Marcus clean up. Paper plates and cups, crumpled wrapping paper, the detritus of celebration. Emily had crashed on the couch, sugar rush, depleted, still wearing the watch and clutching her new veterinary kit. Marcus made coffee, real coffee from beans he ground himself. They sat at the small dining table while Emily slept, drinking from mismatched mugs in companionable silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. He needed to tell Victoria something had been trying to find the right moment for weeks. When she'd been in the hospital after Richard had threatened Emily's insurance, Marcus had been prepared to sign the statement. Not because he wanted to, but because Emily came first, always. He'd walked to that conference room ready to betray Victoria's trust because his daughter's life mattered more than his principles. The confession hung between them. Marcus continued, his voice low. He'd only lasted 5 minutes in that room before he couldn't do it. Couldn't make his hand sign the papers. Couldn't force the lies out of his mouth. He'd walked out knowing he was probably destroying Emily's future, probably losing everything, and he still couldn't do it. That bothered him. Not that he'd refused in the end, but that he'd seriously considered betraying someone who'd shown him basic decency. Victoria set her coffee down carefully. Marcus had been faced with an impossible choice. No one would have blamed him for protecting his daughter. She certainly wouldn't have. The fact that he'd wrestled with it, that he'd felt the weight of competing loyalties that made him human, it didn't make him weak. But that was the thing Marcus insisted. Victoria had never asked for his loyalty. She'd just hired him, expected good work, treated him fairly. And somehow that had created a sense of obligation stronger than self-preservation. He didn't understand how she'd done that, how she'd built that kind of commitment without trying. Victoria considered this. She'd spent years believing loyalty required leverage that you had to give people. Concrete reasons to stay, pay them well, offer advancement, create dependencies. But Marcus was describing something different. Loyalty born from being seen as capable, from having high expectations applied without judgment, from dignity offered freely. She'd stumbled into it by accident. Her management style had never been about building loyalty. It had been about efficiency, about hiring competent people and getting out of their way. She'd treated Marcus the same way she'd treat any professional, which apparently was unusual enough to create deep gratitude. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd tried for years to create loyal teams through careful management of incentives and opportunities. The one person who'd stayed truly loyal was someone she'd barely managed at all, just expected excellence from, and otherwise left alone. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studied her across the table. She was figuring it out, he observed. How to build a company culture that actually meant something beyond quarterly reports. It would take time, would require unlearning years of defensive habits. But she'd get there. Victoria asked how he could be so sure. Marcus smiled at that. Because she was here in his apartment on a Saturday helping clean up after a 9-year-old's birthday party. The old Victoria Ashford wouldn't have come. Hell, the old Victoria wouldn't have been invited. The fact that she was sitting here drinking coffee from a chipped mug meant the transformation was already happening. They talked for another hour. About Emily's school, about Marcus's plans for her future, about the challenges of raising a diabetic child alone. About Victoria's childhood, the parts she rarely discussed. Her father's early death, her mother's difficult remarriage, learning to protect herself by never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. Marcus listened without judgment, without trying to fix or reframe. Just listened. When Victoria finally ran out of words, he simply nodded. That explained a lot. Not as an excuse, but as context. She'd learned early that connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Building an empire on emotional distance made perfect sense given that foundation. But now she was choosing something different. That took courage, Marcus pointed out. More courage than most people had. Victoria wasn't sure about that. She was just trying not to waste what the hospital had taught her. Emily stirred on the couch, woke up disoriented. Marcus went to her, checked her glucose monitor, determined she needed a snack before the reading dropped too low. He got her apple slices and peanut butter settled beside her while she ate. Victoria watched them together, this small family unit functioning with practiced ease, each knowing their role in keeping Emily healthy. It struck her how much work went into this, how much vigilance Marcus maintained every day. Checking readings, calculating carbohydrates, managing insulin dosages, watching for symptoms of highs and lows, all while maintaining a demanding job raising his daughter alone, being the kind of person who refused to compromise his integrity even when threatened. Emily finished her snack, noticed Victoria still there. Would Ms. Ashford like to watch a movie with them? They usually watched something on Emily's birthday evening. Victoria checked the time. It was nearly 7. She had work to review emails, to answer strategic plans to finalize. The old Victoria would have made excuses, would have left hours ago. She'd love to watch a movie with them. They ended up watching an animated film about a girl who befriended a dragon. Emily provided running commentary explaining plot points and character motivations. Marcus made popcorn, distributed it in bowls. Victoria sat on the worn couch between them, eating popcorn and watching a children's movie, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for years. When the credits rolled, Emily was asleep again this time, leaning against Victoria's shoulder. Marcus carefully extracted his daughter, carried her to the bedroom. Victoria heard him talking softly, heard Emily mumbling responses, heard the familiar routine of a father putting his child to bed. Marcus returned, looking exhausted but content. Best birthday Emily had ever had, he reported. She'd told him so 3 times while he was tucking her in, especially the part where Ms. Ashford came and helped her team win the scavenger hunt. That was the best. Victoria felt disproportionately pleased by this. She gathered her things, prepared to leave. Marcus walked her to the door, thanked her for coming, for the gift, for being exactly the kind of person Emily needed to see. Strong women who built empires but still showed up for birthday parties. That was important representation. Victoria promised Emily she'd visit again soon. Marcus held her eyes for a moment, then spoke carefully. She should know something. When Emily talked about people she admired, people she wanted to be like when she grew up, Victoria's name was on that list now, right alongside veterinarians and teachers and Sarah. The information hit harder than it should have. Victoria managed something appropriate about being honored, about hoping she'd deserve that admiration. Marcus's smile suggested she already did. The drive home took longer than the drive there, Saturday night traffic thick through the city. Victoria replayed the day, examining it from multiple angles. She'd gone to a child's birthday party. She'd helped organize games, distributed juice boxes, sat on a worn couch watching animated movies. Nothing about the day had involved business strategy or competitive advantage or shareholder value, and yet it felt more significant than most board meetings she'd attended, more real than quarterly earnings calls, more human than any corporate function. Her phone buzzed at a red light. Text from Marcus, a photo attached. Emily asleep in bed, still wearing the watch veterinary kit clutched to her chest. The caption read, "Thank you for making her day. She won't forget this." Neither would Victoria. She saved the photo, filed it away with the growing collection of moments that mattered in ways balance sheets couldn't measure. Monday morning brought her back to Ashford Technologies with renewed focus. The weekend had clarified something. She'd been approaching the company transformation as a strategic initiative, something to be planned and implemented through policy changes and restructuring. But what Marcus had shown her was simpler and harder. Culture changed one interaction at a time, one person at a time, through consistent behavior rather than grand gestures. She started with department heads, individual meetings asking about their teams, their challenges, their people. Really asking, then actually listening to the answers. She learned names, learned stories, learned about the humans behind the job titles, a marketing director dealing with his mother's dementia, a security engineer putting herself through night school for a graduate degree, a project manager whose partner had just had twins. None of this information affected their work performance. All of it affected how Victoria understood them as complete people rather than just resources deployed toward company objectives. The shift was subtle but noticeable. People responded differently when they realized their CEO actually remembered their names, their situations, their lives outside work. Productivity increased not through pressure, but through engagement. People worked harder for someone who saw them as human. Marcus observed the changes from his position as chief of staff. He mentioned it during one of their morning coffee meetings, the ones that had become routine over the past months. Victoria was getting better at this, at being present rather than just performing leadership. People noticed. People talked. The company culture was shifting in real time. Victoria asked his act if it was enough. If this slower, more personal approach would actually transform Ashford Technologies into something fundamentally different. Marcus considered the question carefully. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were healthy organizations. But the foundation was solid. The intention was genuine. The rest would come with consistent effort. 3 months after Emily's birthday party, Ashford Technologies closed its largest acquisition to date. A Seattle-based cybersecurity firm, 200 employees, cutting-edge technology in threat detection. The deal had been in negotiation for 8 months, had required careful maneuvering and strategic compromise. Victoria flew to Seattle for the announcement, brought Marcus with her. The acquired company's CEO was a woman named Jennifer Park, 46, who'd built her firm from nothing over 12 years. She'd been reluctant to sell, had resisted multiple overtures from larger companies. But something about Victoria's approach, about Ashford's culture under new leadership, had convinced her this was the right move. They met in Jennifer's office overlooking Elliott Bay. Rain fell steadily outside, typical Seattle weather. Jennifer got straight to the point. She'd heard things about Victoria Ashford. Ruthless, calculating, willing to do whatever it took to win. That reputation had made her reluctant to even consider the acquisition. But then Jennifer had talked to David Wells, who'd described a CEO who'd learned to balance strength with humanity, who'd been willing to give second chances, who'd promoted an assistant to chief of staff based on character rather than credentials, who'd restructured her entire board to prioritize values over just valuations. Jennifer had investigated further. Talked to Ashford employees, reviewed company culture assessments, examined retention rates. What she'd found suggested Victoria had undergone some kind of transformation. Jennifer wanted to know what had caused it. Victoria considered how much to share. The accident, the hospital, the 9 days of observation, Richard's attempted coup, Marcus's loyalty, Emily's birthday party. All of it had combined to break down armor she'd worn for 14 years, force her to see what actually mattered beyond quarterly earnings and market share. Jennifer listened without interruption. When Victoria finished, the other CEO sat quietly for a long moment. Then she admitted something. She'd almost lost her own company 3 years ago, during a cash flow crisis that had brought them within weeks of bankruptcy. She'd been so focused on growth, on expansion, on building something impressive that she'd neglected the people doing the actual work. One of her engineers had quit, had written a resignation letter that laid out exactly how toxic the culture had become. That letter had shaken Jennifer badly enough that she'd done her own version of Victoria's hospital observation. She'd spent a month just listening, really listening to what her people were experiencing. The changes she'd made afterward had saved the company, but more importantly, had saved her from becoming someone she didn't want to be. They understood each other, Jennifer concluded. They'd both learned the hard way that building something that mattered required more than just strategic brilliance. It required actually caring about the people who made the strategy real. The acquisition closed 2 weeks later. Integration planning began immediately, with Victoria personally involved in culture alignment. She met with teams from the Seattle office, answered questions, addressed concerns, made it clear that she valued what they'd built, wanted to preserve it, rather than simply absorbing it into Ashford's existing structure. Marcus handled the operational logistics, coordinating between offices, managing timelines, ensuring smooth transition. He'd grown into the chief of staff role with natural authority, commanding respect through competence and integrity rather than title. People trusted him because he'd proven trustworthy consistently, without exception. One evening, working late on integration documents, Victoria asked Marcus if he ever regretted staying loyal during the hospital crisis. If he ever thought about what might have been different if he'd signed Richard's statement, kept his job secure without the risk. Marcus didn't hesitate, not for 1 second. Signing that statement would have meant teaching Emily that integrity could be traded for security, that principles were negotiable under pressure. He'd rather struggle financially than raise his daughter to believe that. Besides, Marcus continued, if he'd signed the statement, he wouldn't be chief of staff now. Wouldn't be helping build something genuinely good instead of just profitable. Wouldn't be watching Victoria transform a company culture through sheer determined effort. The cost of comfort would have been missing all of this. Victoria understood what he meant. The accident had cost her 2 weeks of consciousness and months of recovery. But it had also stripped away every false assumption, every defensive barrier, every comfortable delusion about what mattered. The cost had been worth the clarity. 6 months after the Seattle acquisition, Ashford Technologies held its annual company meeting. Every employee from newest intern to senior executive gathered in the main auditorium. Victoria stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of faces and felt something she'd never felt before at these events. Connection. These weren't just resources deployed toward business objectives. They were people complete and complex who'd chosen to spend their working lives building something together. She spoke about the company's success, the strong financial results, the strategic positioning. But she also spoke about culture, about values, about building an organization where people could do their best work without sacrificing their humanity. She talked about mistakes she'd made, lessons she'd learned, changes she was still implementing. And she talked about loyalty. Not the transactional kind built on paychecks and benefits packages, but the deeper kind built on mutual respect and fair treatment, and seeing people as capable rather than as complications. The kind of loyalty that couldn't be purchased, only earned through consistent behavior over time. She looked at Marcus while she spoke, sitting in the front row with his usual quiet presence. He'd taught her what that kind of loyalty looked like, had demonstrated it when it would have been easier and safer to compromise. She owed him more than a promotion. She owed him the example he'd set, the standard he'd maintained, the reminder that character mattered more than convenience. The speech ended with standing ovation, which felt excessive but genuine. Afterward, employees approached Victoria in small groups, thanking her for the changes, for the new culture, for making Ashford Technologies a place they were proud to work. Some shared their own stories of transformation, of learning to lead with humanity rather than just authority. Jennifer Park flew down from Seattle for the meeting, brought her senior team. She pulled Victoria aside during the reception, spoke bluntly. Whatever Victoria was doing, whatever alchemy she'd discovered that turned ruthless pragmatism into genuine leadership, she should bottle it. The industry needed more of this. Needed leaders who could balance strength with wisdom. Victoria deflected the praise. She was just trying not to waste what a car accident had taught her. Jennifer laughed at that, a sound both bitter and amused. Most people learned nothing from their wake-up calls, just went back to old patterns as soon as the immediate crisis passed. Victoria had actually changed, actually sustained the transformation. That was rare. The evening wound down. Victoria found herself standing with Marcus near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco Bay. The city lights reflected off dark water, creating patterns that shifted with each wave. They'd come a long way from that hospital room, from those 9 days of observation and revelation. Marcus broke the silence first. Emily wanted to know when Victoria would visit again. She'd been asking weekly, apparently wondering when Ms. Ashford would come for dinner or another movie. Marcus had been deflecting, not wanting to impose, but Emily was persistent. Victoria suggested this weekend, Saturday evening if that worked. She'd bring dinner something Emily would like. Marcus accepted, looking pleased. Emily would be thrilled. She'd probably wear the watch and plan the whole evening down to which movie they'd watch. They stood quietly for another moment. Then Marcus said very carefully that he was glad Victoria had survived the accident. Not just survived, but come through. It changed in ways that mattered. The world needed more leaders who'd learned wisdom instead of just accumulating power. Victoria Ashford version 2.0 was someone worth knowing. Victoria felt emotion tighten her throat. She managed to respond that she'd needed someone to demonstrate what integrity looked like under pressure. Marcus had done that, had shown her what loyalty meant when it wasn't transactional. She'd been paying attention, trying to learn from the example. The last guests filtered out. Victoria and Marcus walked to the parking garage together, a routine established over months of late evenings finishing projects. At Marcus's car, they paused. He thanked her again for everything, for the opportunity, for the trust, for seeing him as more than just a single father with complications. Victoria corrected him gently. She'd seen him as competent 7 years ago. Now she saw him as essential, as someone who'd helped build something that mattered beyond profit margins. The difference was significant. They said goodnight. Victoria drove home through familiar streets, processing the day, the speech, the conversations. She'd built an empire on ruthless pragmatism and careful distance. Then she'd been forced to lie vulnerable and observe what people really were when they thought no one was watching. That observation had changed everything. Saturday evening arrived with fog rolling in from the Pacific. Victoria drove to the outer sunset carrying bags of Thai food and homemade cookies she'd attempted to bake. The cookies had turned out acceptable, which felt like a victory. The old Victoria hadn't owned a mixing bowl, much less known how to use one. Emily met her at the door, still wearing the watch, bouncing with barely contained excitement. Ms. Ashford came, and she brought cookies. Did she know those were Emily's favorite? Victoria admitted she'd asked Marcus for guidance on appropriate treats for 9-year-olds with diabetes. Emily appreciated the consideration, explained carefully about carbohydrate counting, while helping unpack the food. They ate together at the small dining table, Emily describing her school week with the kind of detail only children provide. A substitute teacher who couldn't control the class a science project about photosynthesis. A classmate who'd been mean, but then apologized. Victoria listened, asked questions, found herself genuinely interested in the minutiae of 4th grade social dynamics. After dinner, Marcus loaded the dishwasher while Victoria and Emily set up for their movie. Emily had chosen carefully a film about a girl who wanted to be a scientist despite everyone telling her to be realistic. Victoria recognized the metaphor, appreciated Emily's selection process. They settled on the couch, Emily in the middle, and watched a story about perseverance and believing in yourself. During a quiet scene, Emily spoke suddenly. Did Ms. Ashford ever want kids? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Victoria needed a moment to formulate an answer. She'd never thought about it seriously, had been too focused on building her company. But now, sitting here with Emily and Marcus, she wondered if she'd missed something important by never considering that possibility. Emily took her silence as a negative answer, patted Victoria's hand consolingly. That was okay. Some people were meant to do other important things, like running companies and helping daddies keep their jobs and coming to birthday parties, even when you're probably really busy. Marcus returned from the kitchen in time to hear this exchange. He met Victoria's eyes over his daughter's head, something passing between them that didn't need words. They'd both made choices, both sacrificed certain possibilities to pursue others. Those choices had led them here to this small apartment and this moment of unexpected connection. The movie ended. Emily began fading, the long week catching up with her. Marcus carried her to bed, returned to find Victoria washing the remaining dishes. She waved off his protest. She'd brought the mess, she'd help clean it. They worked in comfortable silence until everything was put away. Then Marcus made his customary coffee, the good beans ground fresh. They sat at the dining table, the same position they'd occupied months ago after Emily's birthday party. But the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer CEO and employee, not exactly. They were something closer to friends bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Victoria asked the question that had been building for weeks. Why did Marcus stay really? Not just refuse to sign Richard's statement, but why continue working for Ashford Technologies afterward? He had skills, experience, opportunities elsewhere. Companies would value his integrity, his competence. Why remain? Marcus considered his answer carefully, because what they were building mattered, not just the company, but the culture they were creating together. The example they were setting. The proof that businesses could be successful and humane simultaneously. He wanted to be part of that. Wanted Emily to grow up seeing that integrity and success weren't mutually exclusive. Plus, Marcus added with a slight smile, where else would he find a CEO who showed up for children's birthday parties and attempted to bake cookies despite clearly never having used an oven? Before Victoria laughed at that, the sound surprising her. When had she started laughing so easily? The old Victoria had smiled strategically, had deployed humor as a management tool. This felt different, natural, real. They talked past midnight conversation ranging from company strategy to Emily's college fund to Marcus's plans for her future. He wanted her to have opportunities. He'd never had education without debt choices, without constraints. Victoria understood that drive, that parental determination to provide better. Her father had worked himself to death building something for her, leaving behind only a watch, and the determination to never need anyone's help. But that determination had cost her, had isolated her, had nearly let her miss the one person whose loyalty was genuine rather than calculated. She'd learned too late that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Marcus stood to leave, needed to check on Emily one more time before bed. Victoria gathered her things, prepared to drive home. At the door, Marcus hesitated, then spoke carefully. He wanted her to know something. Emily had started telling people at school that Ms. Ashford was her friend, not her dad's boss, not some important lady. Her friend. The designation carried weight beyond its simplicity. Emily's friend. Someone who showed up, who kept promises, who brought cookies and watched movies, and understood that connection mattered more than status. Victoria had spent 14 years accumulating titles and achievements. None of them felt as significant as being Emily's friend. She drove home through fog-thick streets, processing the evening, the conversation, the life she was slowly building outside of conference rooms and earnings calls. Her penthouse apartment still felt empty when she returned, but less so than before. She was filling it with memories now, with photos and small gifts and reminders of connection. Her phone buzzed with a text, Emily using Marcus's phone. A photo of the veterinary kit Victoria had given her, now supplemented with additional supplies Emily had researched and saved allowance money to buy. The caption read, "Getting ready for my future. Thank you for believing in me. Ms. Ashford." Victoria saved the photo, added it to the growing collection. Emily's birthday party, movie nights, company events. Moments that documented a transformation Victoria was still learning to navigate. She'd been powerful before. Now she was becoming human. The difference mattered more than she'd ever imagined. Monday brought new challenges. The Seattle integration was hitting complications, cultural differences creating friction between teams. Victoria flew up personally, spent a week working directly with combined departments, addressing concerns, mediating conflicts. She approached it differently than she would have a year ago. Less about imposing solutions, more about facilitating understanding. Jennifer appreciated the hands-on approach. Most CEOs would have delegated. This would have sent HR or middle management to smooth things over. Victoria's willingness to sit in conference rooms and listen to frustrated engineers, to acknowledge legitimate concerns and actually address them, that made a difference. The week ended with integrated teams functioning smoothly, not perfectly, but cooperatively. Victoria flew back to San Francisco exhausted but satisfied. She'd built a company through ruthless pragmatism. Now she was learning to lead it through patient wisdom. The work was harder, required more emotional investment, but the results felt more durable. Marcus met her at the office, brought coffee, and a debrief agenda. They worked through Seattle integration status, upcoming board meetings, strategic planning for the next quarter. But between agenda items, Marcus mentioned that Emily had been asking about Thanksgiving. Whether Ms. Ashford had family plans, whether she'd be spending the holiday alone. Victoria admitted she typically worked through Thanksgiving, had never seen it as particularly significant. Marcus looked pained at this confession. Nobody should work through Thanksgiving. If she didn't have family, she should come to them. Emily would never forgive him if he didn't invite her properly. The invitation was genuine, Victoria could see that. Not obligation or pity, but real desire for her company. She accepted before she could overthink it. Thanksgiving dinner at Marcus's apartment, helping Emily learn to cook traditional dishes. It sounded chaotic and warm, and nothing like any holiday she'd experienced. The weeks until Thanksgiving passed in a blur of work and preparation. Victoria found herself researching traditional side dishes, buying ingredients, practicing recipes in her rarely used kitchen. The transformation from CEO who lived on takeout to someone attempting green bean casserole felt absurd and necessary. Thanksgiving morning arrived clear and cold. Victoria drove to the outer sunset, loaded with grocery bags, her attempted dishes carefully packed. Emily greeted her wearing an apron that dragged on the floor, face smudged with flour. They were making pies, she announced. Would Ms. Ashford help? Victoria spent the morning in a small kitchen with Marcus and Emily, learning to crimp pie crusts and baste a turkey and time side dishes, so everything finished simultaneously. The precision required was different from business strategy, but no less demanding. Emily took her role as junior chef, seriously consulting recipes and issuing instructions with authoritative certainty. The meal came together by early afternoon. They ate at the small dining table, barely big enough for 3 place settings and multiple dishes. Marcus said grace, something Victoria hadn't experienced since childhood. She bowed her head, listened to his thanks for food and family and unexpected blessings, and felt emotion tighten her throat. After dinner, after dishes, they walked to Ocean Beach. Cold wind off the Pacific, salt spray in the air. San Francisco stretched out behind them. Emily ran ahead, chasing seagulls, while Victoria and Marcus walked at a slower pace. Marcus spoke quietly. He'd been thinking about that hospital room, about the choice he'd almost made, about how close he'd come to signing Richard's statement to protect Emily. It still bothered him, that moment of weakness, even though he'd ultimately refused. Victoria understood what he wasn't saying. He was still processing the trauma of that crisis, still working through what it had cost him emotionally. She'd been so focused on her own transformation that she'd missed how much the experience had affected Marcus as well. She told him something she'd realized recently. Courage wasn't the absence of fear or doubt. It was acting with integrity despite fear, despite doubt, despite every rational reason to compromise. He'd demonstrated that kind of courage. The fact that he'd been afraid, that he'd considered alternatives, that only made his final choice more meaningful. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting this framework. They walked in silence, watching Emily explore tide pools, listening to waves crash against rocks. The moment felt significant in ways Victoria couldn't quite articulate. She'd spent 14 years building walls, protecting herself from connection. Now she stood on a beach with a man who'd proven loyalty wasn't transactional, and his daughter who'd decided Victoria was worth befriending. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that had no business being real. Emily returned from her explorations cold and happy, ready to go home. They walked back to the car together, 3 people who'd found each other through circumstance and choice. That evening, after they'd returned to the apartment and eaten leftover pie and watched Emily fall asleep halfway through another movie, Victoria prepared to leave. Marcus walked her to the door, thanked her for coming, for making the day special. Emily had been so excited, had talked all week about Ms. Ashford joining them. Victoria admitted the truth. She'd been excited too, had looked forward to this day more than any business event in recent memory. She was learning that connection mattered more than achievement, that showing up for people was worth more than strategic victories. Marcus studied her face in the dim hallway light. She'd come a long way from the woman who'd lain in a hospital bed cataloging betrayals. That woman had been powerful, but alone. This woman was powerful and connected. The difference was everything. Victoria drove home through dark streets full of turkey and pie and something that felt dangerously close to contentment. She'd built an empire believing that isolation was strength, that emotional distance was protection. 9 days in a hospital bed had dismantled that belief, shown her what actually mattered when power disappeared. She'd learned that the people worth keeping weren't the ones who stayed when you had everything to offer. They were the ones who stayed when you had nothing, when you were vulnerable and powerless, and couldn't give them anything except the memory of being treated fairly. Marcus had been that person. Emily had become that person. Together they'd taught Victoria that building something that lasted required more than just strategic brilliance. It required being human enough to deserve loyalty, rather than just command it. Her phone buzzed at a red light. Marcus texting a photo. Emily asleep on the couch, still wearing Victoria's watch covered with a blanket decorated with stars. The caption was simple. She says today was perfect. Thank you for being here. Victoria saved the photo, added it to all the others. Moments of connection documented and treasured. She'd spent 14 years accumulating very different trophies. Stock certificates, acquisition agreements, patents, and proprietary technologies. Those things still mattered, but they mattered less than she'd thought, and these moments mattered more. She'd built an empire on ruthless pragmatism. Now she was learning to inhabit it with wisdom instead. The journey from one to the other had required a car accident, 9 days of forced observation, and the loyalty of a single father who'd refused to compromise his integrity. The cost had been steep. The reward was discovering that power without humanity was just isolation with better furniture, and that being truly strong meant being willing to connect, to trust, to let people in, despite every risk. Victoria pulled into her building's garage, sat in her car for a long moment before heading upstairs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove she'd learned what the hospital had taught her. But tonight, she was just grateful. Grateful for survival, for transformation, for the unexpected gift of being Emily's friend and Marcus's trusted colleague, and a person capable of showing up for Thanksgiving dinner with homemade green bean casserole. The old Victoria Ashford had been powerful. This Victoria Ashford was becoming whole, and that she was beginning to understand made all the difference.